Greetings fellow comrades and newcomers alike. Today we are creating the ultimate Talion of Gondor build in Baldur's Gate 3. I actually have two builds for you, and so I will attempt to keep this video as quick, clear, and concise as possible. This will most likely be my new style of showcasing builds from here on. Drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more goblin-hating, evil-slaying content, and ring the bell so you don't miss out. Timestamps are in the description as usual for your convenience. For the most detailed overview possible of not only Talion, but my growing library of builds, consider visiting the Patreon where these lovely folk have gathered round. Thank you all for your support. You all are absolute legends, and you're beautiful. More on this at the end of the video if you want to further support the channel. Welcome to Purge Evil. Thank you for stopping by. Let's get into it. Okay, first things first, I'm going to be summarizing a bit more than I usually would to really try to get these builds across in less time. I'm going to refrain from explaining every spell and ability, as I'll never be able to get these builds out for you guys if I continue that way. If you have any questions at any point, do not hesitate to leave a comment, as me or someone else will likely have an answer. As stated, I have two builds to showcase. The first option is more thematic and good for role-playing as Talion, and the second option is a bit more OP mechanically, but still thematic nonetheless, albeit not as much as option 1. For a more stealthy version of Talion, we will take Ranger 3 and Cleric 9. For extra attack on this option, simply substitute 2 Cleric levels for 2 Ranger levels and use the Nymph Cloak to dominate enemies, which we would otherwise get naturally from Cleric 9. More direct, in-your-face Talion would see us taking Bard 3 and 9 Warlock. 9 Warlock will allow Talion to have both dominate person and beast prepared. This path will see us getting extra attack at level 8. If you feel you need it earlier, simply play Bard till 6, take 2 Warlock, and then at level 8, respec for 3 Bard and 5 Warlock following this guide. Quick note, all footage in this video is of build 2. Talion can be played however you choose in his games, and so I think having a stealth version and a loud version makes a lot of sense. With that being said, let's begin the first Talion build. Build 1. For the race of both builds, most would choose human, but I will actually recommend half-elf. This will help to further describe the Celebrimbor association with the elven racial passives. Talion is no longer just a normal human, and the best way to reflect that straight out the gate is by acquiring the passives that Celebrimbor's influence would be granting Talion. Background for both builds is Soldier for athletics and intimidation, which is much more useful for Talion than Outlander, and he was also the captain of the guard during his mortal lifetime. This version of Talion begins the game classically as the Ranger, taking Ranger Knight or Keeper of the Veil for flavor, and Wasteland Wanderer Fire for fire resistance. Starting stats will be Strength at 12, Dex at 16, Constitution at 14, Intelligence at 8, Wisdom at 16, and Charisma at 8. If you want 20 in either Dex or Wisdom, drop Strength to 10 for 17 of either stat and acquire the Hag's Hair. I don't recommend aiming for 3 feats with this build, but Hag's Hair is also not necessary for this version of Talion, so pick your poison. 18 Dex and 18 Wisdom is just fine. Take any combination of Insight, Stealth, Perception, and Survival for your skills. You can gain all of these by getting the extra proficiency point from choosing Human if you desire. At level 2, you'll take Archery as your fighting style. Don't worry, melee is fully viable for this build. The archery fighting style is just OP for the early game. Take Hunter's Mark and Longstrider, ensure that you and the party are buffed at all times with the latter. At level 3, we acquire Gloomstalker, which grants Talion Dread Ambusher, allowing him to get a free attack at the start of combat with extra damage, along with a bonus action Sneak. Perfect for getting in and out, then reinitiating for ultimate stealth executions. If things get messy, you can always pop the Umbral Shroud, which grants you standard invisibility. You can only use this once per short rest though, so I would save it for those times you might need to flee. At level 4, we multi-class into Cleric for the remainder of the build, and yes, that's right, our subclass will be none other than Trickery Domain. One of the worst reputation subclasses, the Trickery Domain is actually quite powerful when used correctly and is a beautiful addition to any stealth party. Again, if you need extra attack, take Ranger to 5 and then the rest into Cleric. Won't get Dominate Person prepared, but you can still use it by wearing the Nymph Cloak. Essentially every spell is described by Celebrimbor's power. Here we will take Blade Ward, Guidance, and Thaumaturgy for cantrips. For spells, go ahead and prepare Command, Bane, which usually doesn't get used, but it is flavorful, Cure Wounds, and Inflict Wounds. We also now have Charm Person always prepared as a precursor to holding and dominating them. Blessing of the Trickster is our other trickery ability and grants advantage to a party member's stealth checks. At level 5, we gain Turn Undead and Invoke Duplicity, the latter being especially flavorful as Celebrimbor can now reveal himself as an illusion to the enemy, distracting them and giving allies advantage within 3 meters. I prepared Shield of Faith here. At level 6, we get 2 beautiful always prepared spells courtesy of Trickery Domain with Mirror Image and Pass Without Trace. Mirror Image summons more illusions of Talion / Celebrimbor to confuse enemies, granting Talion +3 armor class per duplicate, and each time you're attacked, 1 duplicate will disappear. Pass Without Trace is the ultimate stealth ability. It grants you and allies within 9 meters a massive +10 bonus to stealth checks, virtually turning you into Skyrim Stealth Archer. It also lasts until long rest, unless concentration is broken. For the prepared spell, you're going to want to remove one you have slotted to make room for Spiritual Weapon, which can be flavored as a Wraith Weapon, and Hold Person, which is pretty obvious. Aside from flavor, Hold Person can absolutely trivialize some fights, as it causes every attack within 3 meters against that target to be a critical. At level 7, we gain our first feat, which will be ability improvement and can either be put into Dex or Wisdom. I personally chose Dex, but Wisdom is not wrong to choose, especially if you're leaning more into the Wraith powers. Choose Resistance for your cantrip and prepare Enhance Ability, which grants advantage on ability checks of your choice. Very useful throughout the entire game and lasts until long rest so long as you maintain concentration. At level 8, we gain the always prepared and flavorful Fear spell along with Bestow Curse. It goes without saying that you should prepare Spirit Guardians by this point, especially being that we are now deep into Act 2. At level 9, we get Cloak of Shadows, which costs a normal action to turn you invisible for 2 turns. Really useful for fleeing and ambushing. Here I prepare Animate Dead and flavored it as if I was controlling orcs, although this requires some pretty strong suspension of belief. At level 10, we will ignore Polymorph, but Dimension Door I guess can be flavorful. Nonetheless, it teleports you and an ally, so is useful regardless. Here I prepared Guardian of Faith and flavored this as a manifestation of the Wraith. At level 11, we gain Divine Strike Poison, which simply adds 1d8 poison damage to a weapon attack once per turn, increasing your lethality by default. We also acquire our second ability improvement, which will go to Wisdom, allowing us to prepare 2 more spells. I felt Death Ward was appropriate, as well as Freedom of Movement. Note that Freedom of Movement is largely unnecessary for Talion himself, considering gear that we will discuss, but is incredibly useful for helping an ally out of stuns or difficult terrain. And finally, at level 12, we gain the always prepared Dominate Person, allowing Talion / Celebrimbor to brand his foes, forcing them to fight alongside him. Again, this spell can also be used once per long rest by acquiring the Nymph Cloak if you want extra attack for this build. I prepared Planner Binding and Flame Strike because they're badass. Now that wraps up build 1, and since the gear for both builds are virtually identical apart from some minor differences, we will save that for the end of the video, and I will now dive into build 2. Depending on who you ask, build 2 is the stronger version. Build 2. So for this version of Talion, we are taking a more direct approach to Purge Evil. Race, background, and skills will of course be the same, but here we begin the build with Bard. I chose the Drum. Take Blade Ward and Light for your cantrips. For spells, take Long Strider and always buff your party with it, Heroism, Cure Wounds, and Dissonant Whispers, which I like to flavor as a precursor to branding. Celebrimbor getting in the heads of enemies type of stuff. For starting stats, Strength at 8, Dex at 16, Constitution at 14, Intelligence at 8, Wisdom at 10, and Charisma at 17. This build utilizes the Hag's Hair, but isn't entirely necessary if you're unable to acquire it, as Charisma can be buffed with 2 gear pieces I will recommend in Act 3. Do note that this build will utilize Pact of the Blade, which causes your attack rolls to use Charisma instead of Strength or Dex. Consider a respec after Warlock 3 to change Dex to 14 and Constitution to 16. I will remind you of this at that point in the build. We will not take feats for Constitution, and instead will wear the Amulet of Greater Health in the late game. So moving on to level 2, we gain our Bard stuff and a spell to learn. Charm Person is pretty useful early on and is flavorful. I will, however, recommend taking Featherfall, especially for the later game. At level 3, we unlock our subclass, which has to be College of Swords, so Talion can now play his brutal role of teleporting between enemies, bringing annihilation. These flourish abilities will only become more useful as the build progresses. For the 2 skills, take Insight and Perception. Consider taking Stealth in place of one of these. Fighting style can be either dueling or dual wielding. I chose dueling and opted for a shield and longsword combo early on, though I won't be specifically recommending any shields, as they are essentially a placeholder. At some point, Talion will disregard this and begin two-handing his longsword. There are 2 short swords that can be dual wielded in Act 2, but are more useful for build 1, and so for these reasons, I chose dueling over dual wielding. For the spell, take Enhance Ability for the same reason as build 1. Now, similar to the previous build, you can continue to Bard 6 if you need extra attack earlier, but I will instead describe the general build path, which sees us getting extra attack at level 8. That being said, at level 4 we will multi-class into Warlock. Subclass will be none other than Archfey. This will grant us Fey Presence, which can frighten or charm targets within a 3-meter radius of Talion. This is one of my favorites. Take Eldritch Blast if you didn't run to it already, Bone Chill as well for your cantrips. Flavor Eldritch Blast as Wraith Arrows. For spells, make sure to take Hex, and the second one doesn't matter too much, but I chose Fairy Fire. At level 5, Warlock 2, take Agonizing Blast and Devil's Sight for Eldritch invocations. I took Armor of Agathis here for the spell. At level 6, we can acquire Darkness, which can be headcanoned once again to be Talion's stealth capabilities, but we're really taking it to just destroy everything in the game. We also acquire our Pact Boon, which will be Pact of the Blade as previously stated. Make sure to keep your main weapon bound so it scales with Charisma. This is the point in the build in which you would respec for 14 Dex and 16 Constitution. For a replacement spell, switch out Fairy Fire for Mirror Image, as Fairy Fire is now useless to the build. At level 7, Warlock 4, we gain our first feat, which will be Ability Improvement to raise our Charisma to 20, considering you acquired the Hag's Hair. For the cantrip, Friends is the best option. Take Misty Step for your spell for obvious reasons, and replace Armor of Agathis with Hold Person. At level 8, we at last gain our extra attack. Repelling Blast is the best option for the invocation. Take Vampiric Touch for your spell, as this will allow the Wraith to steal health from enemies and can be recast without expending a spell slot for 10 turns so long as you maintain concentration. Replace the Hex spell with Remove Curse. At level 9, we gain the Archfey special called Misty Escape, one of the best reasons for choosing Archfey aside from the Dominate spells. Misty Escape allows you to use a reaction to become invisible whenever you take damage, and also lets you cast Misty Step on your next turn for free. Absolutely perfect. For the spell, go ahead and take Fear. At level 10, I chose Dreadful Word for the invocation, as Confusion is just an outright busted ability. It can also act as a form of branding, causing enemies to attack their own allies. One of the most powerful crowd control abilities, right next to Darkness, and perfectly flavorful for Talion. For the spell, you already know we have to take Dominate Beast, so Talion and Friend can brand beasts. Ultimate flavor. At level 11, choose any spell as it will be replaced next level. For the feat, I just couldn't help myself. Great Weapon Master for Talion's brutal two-handed executions. And finally, at level 12, take Otherworldly Leap for your invocation, which is a big reason I chose Featherfall at the beginning of the build. For the spell, naturally take Dominate Person and replace your last chosen spell with Hold Monster to officially complete the build. Gear.
We now arrive in the gear section, and this time it's unscripted, fool. Here I have 3 sets of armor, Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. Both builds utilize the same armor, apart from just a couple pieces here and there. So for Act 1, the only headpiece I'll recommend is the Shade Spell Circlet. You can find this in the Myconid Colony. The Adamantine Scale Mail is always useful, but the main armor you're going to want to get is the Spider Silk Armor, and this is worn by Minthara, so however you go about that is up to you. Gloves, we have the Wondrous Gloves and the Gloves of the Growling Underdog. Boots, you have the Disintegrating Nightwalkers, as usual with most builds. It's always the go-to set of boots. For amulets, we have Periapt of Wound Closure, Amulet of Branding, and Amulet of Misty Step. The only ring I'll recommend is the Strange Conduit Ring. This one I actually use up until the end game. For our main weapon in Act 1, we have the Singing Sword, and we have Lorathian's Wrath. And for our ranged weapon in Act 1, we of course have Bow of the Banshee. Make sure you save Damon because he's got a lot of gear in Act 2 and in Act 3. For our Act 2 helmet, we will use the Flawed Helldusk Helmet. Here we will get our first cloak, the Cloak of Protection, and I actually tend to use this up until the end game as well. No chest piece, but for gloves, we have Gloves of the Duelist, and we have Flawed Helldusk Gloves, of course. For rings, we of course first have the Shadowblade Ring and the Ring of Free Action. This is a completely busted ring and you should wear it. Third, we have the Shadow Cloaked Ring, and I tend to wear this up until the end game as well. For Act 2 weapons, we have 2 short swords to recommend with the Render of Mind and Body and the Sword of Life Stealing. You can dual wield these with build 1 and they are absolutely a menace. Also, the Sword of Life Stealing is just completely busted whenever you use Hold Person or Hold Monster, because that guarantees a critical hit every time. And then of course for Act 2 ranged weapon, we have Least Expected. Now moving on to Act 3, apart from what I'm wearing, I'll go over that in just a moment. Our optional pieces of gear are first the Birthright. This is for build 2 only, which increases Charisma by 2. The Helmet of Grit, which gives you an additional bonus action. This would be more useful for build 1. And of course, the Helldusk Helmet, which is useful for any build. Gloves, we have the Quick Spell Gloves. For cloaks, we first have the Nymph Cloak, as mentioned throughout the video. And then we have the Shade Slayer Cloak, more useful for build 1 than it is for build 2. And for an Act 3 ring, we of course have the Keepsake Ring, which allows us a free Dominate Beast once per day. Now for the final set of gear that I tend to wear with Talion. Okay, so helmet is the Saravox Horn Helmet. Cloak is of course the Cloak of Protection. Armor is the Helldusk Armor. Gloves are the Helldusk Gloves. Boots are the Boots of Persistence. Amulet is the Amulet of Greater Health, of course. And the rings are the Strange Conduit Ring and the Shadow Cloaked Ring. Talion's main weapon is Duke Ravengard's Longsword, which gives you a +2 charisma bonus, as well as some other goodies. And of course, for the ranged weapon, we have to have Gaunter Mail. If you made it to this point in the video, you are now obligated to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. If you think these builds were trash, you are now obligated to dislike the video. Come up with something better in the comments. Both of you are now obligated to ring the bell so as to not miss out on future content. Once again, I'd like to give a big shout out to my patrons, and if you'd like to further support the cause and become a fellow slayer of Purge evil, the Patreon is linked down below, where you can support for as little as $1 a month and gain access to exclusive content, including all of my builds in written format, plus way more that will never become videos. Also includes other games, and free members gain access to some exclusive content as well. Got a lot more to share with you all in due time, and if you're still here, I just want to say thank you for stopping by, and until next time, Purge evil.
Yeah, crown in my palm, but I ain't put it on. Yeah, crown in my palm, but I ain't put it on. Yeah, crown in my palm, but I ain't put it on. Yeah, crown in my palm, but I ain't put it on. Yeah.